Hello, friends. Hello, everybody. We're getting started tonight. A little late, so thank you for bearing with us as we get here and get settled. Welcome back to Bible Study Live. This is our third Wednesday of the month Bible study, and I'm here tonight with two awesome people, Peter, who you all sort of know, I think at this point, at least a little bit, and then our guest, Katelyn. And so we are going to have them introduce themselves. But I want to say hi in the chat already. I see people. I see Julia and Amory and Laura and Song Morning, who I don't think I know yet. So hello, new friend, unless I know you under a different name. So thank you all for being here. My name is Austen Hartkey, and I'm the executive director here at Transmission Ministry Collective. And I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight. Peter, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator here at TMC. My pronouns are they, them.
Nice. And I forgot to say my pronouns are he, him. Totally forgot. Thanks, Peter. And Katelyn, you're our guest tonight, and we're so excited to have you here. Will you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, my name is Katelyn. Pronouns are she, her. I am a friendly participant in TMC support groups, and I help lead the gender exploration support group as well.
Yeah, and you're one of the members of our TMC leadership cohort. So one of the awesome people who does that volunteer work, and that we get to go, hey, you're doing a great job. You're being a leader in the community. Thank you. And we get to be really psyched about you, which is fun for me.
It's fun.
Well, thanks for being here. Good. Well, thank you for being here. And thanks to everybody from who's checking in the chat. Oh, Nettle. Okay, good to know that it's you. And then hi, Jeannie. Oh, cute. Great. Okay, so tonight we are talking about a story that we will find in Gospel of John, chapter 9. And so we are going to kind of talk through the story together. We're going to read it. We're going to talk through some questions and thoughts about it. So we're going to jump into that shortly. One announcement I will say before we really get into things, and I'll say it again at the end of the video as well, is that there is no Bible study live next month. So no Bible study live in March, because let me make sure I have the dates right. March 11th through 18th, we are doing a TMC programming break so that all the folks here get to rest a little bit, because we all need to rest periodically. That's a good Sabbath practice. So we're doing that in March. So there will be no March Bible study live, but then we'll see you back again in April. So that's the only announcement I have for you all before we get into our text tonight. So getting into that text, John chapter 9 is what we're reading, and specifically John chapter 9, 1 through 41, which is basically the whole chapter. But we're just going to talk about a couple of big things in it, because we were like, this whole chapter is cohesive. It goes together. We want to talk about the whole story, but we really need to focus in on a few things because we can only talk for an hour. Otherwise, we'll talk your ear off and we'll just go on forever. So we're going to talk about a few things in this story. Let's get some background and some framing before we start the story. This is a story happening in the Gospel of John, like I said before, and the Gospel of John has a series of Jesus showing signs to the people of who he is. And so this is one of the sign stories from John that we're reading. And this is the story of the man born blind. So we are going to give a couple of background pieces, and you might be like, what are you talking about here? We haven't even read the story yet. But because the story is so cohesive, we're going to start out with some background and then get into the actual story itself. So let's start out with one thing that we need to talk about when we talk about any story in the Gospel of John, and that is John's understanding and use of the words Pharisees and the Jews, quote unquote Pharisees and quote unquote the Jews. The Gospel of John has been sort of it's arguably, people argue about whether it's the most anti-Semitic gospel, which is a hard thing to figure out how to deal with as Christians. It's a book that seems to pit Jesus followers against the Jewish people of the time and kind of draw them in this stark sort of good versus bad light. And one of the things that's important to talk about when we talk about any story in the Gospel of John that talks about the Jews or the Pharisees is to remember why John was writing that way. John and the people who wrote the community around John, who wrote the book of John, the Gospel of John, had experienced negative things with the Jewish community at the time that they were writing. And so a lot of what we can think about as the relations between Christians and Jews in the time of John's writing is based in a lot of that trauma. And so when we read these stories, we really have to be aware of the sort of the background about why there was bad blood between these groups. And secondly, that we don't want to perpetuate the bad blood that was happening, because a lot of what the Gospel of John can do when we sort of pit Jews and Christians against each other is we can end up perpetuating these anti-Semitic views in our own time. And so we want to be very careful about not doing that. So we have to think about that, especially when we think about Jesus and the Jewish people. And we wanted to get that out of the way right at the front. The second thing we want to talk about in this story has to do with disability. So Peter, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, this is one of the first things when we were talking about what passage to talk about today. When we sort of settled on this story, one of the first things we all talked about was, well, how do we make sure that we're looking at the story through the lens of disabled theologians and people thinking about a theology of disability. These stories about healing, Jesus healing someone, we've seen these stories get weaponized sometimes against disabled folks, or sometimes they are used with the implication that a disability is something that needs to be healed or needs to be taken away in order for folks to be like whole in the eyes of God, in the eyes of their faith community. So one of the sources that actually Micah Melody recommended to us, and that I used as a source really for my whole reflection on this passage, was Amy Kenny, disabled theologian. Her book, My Body Is Not a Prayer Request, Disability Justice in the Church. And she has this whole lengthy, like her whole first chapter is basically focused on this passage. So she thinks a lot about it in relationship to her own experience of disability and disability theology. But I thought I found this really beautiful quote from it that I thought would be a good place to start to kind of frame our thinking about this story. So Amy Kenny says, "To assume that my disability needs to be erased in order for me to live an abundant life is disturbing, not only because of what it says about me, but also because of what it reveals about people's notions of God. I bear the image of the Alpha and the Omega. My disabled body is a temple for the Holy Spirit. I have the mind of Christ. There's no caveat to those promises. To suggest that I am anything less than sanctified and redeemed is to suppress the image of God in my disabled body and to limit how God is already at work through my life. Maybe we need to be freed not from disability, but from the notion that it limits my ability to showcase God's radiance to the church. What we need to be freed from is ableism." So that just seemed like a really good place to start in talking about a story, about a person experiencing disability and healing and how those things relate to each other.
Absolutely. That last sentence especially is so powerful. Like what we need to be freed from is ableism.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two things that we want to keep in mind as we frame this passage, is how it's been used in anti-Semitic ways and how it's been used against disabled people. And then Katelyn, we're also talking a little bit about like how those two things connect, and then why we're talking about it as trans Christians.
Yeah, I mean, and I think Peter had such great stuff about why you have to talk about what is disability, how do current Christians talk about disability, especially those who don't have a disability. But we also are thinking of this, a lot of us, as trans people, and trying to find ourselves in different texts like this without ignoring other ways that these passages have been read in both helpful and harmful ways towards different marginalized communities. There's a great quote from Jennifer Koosed and Darla Schumm that says, like, it is imperative that marginalized communities realize the intersections between exclusions and oppressions in an effort to combat their consequences. So how do we as trans people, how does our experience in society mirror, parallel, or kind of go against the experience of disabled people in our society, knowing that there can be really harmful ways to read a passage like this. Austen, you talked about finding ways to kind of not dig into the anti-Semitism, and I see there's a good comment in the chat about that I'm sure you're probably going to address here in a moment, but also not falling into some tropes, some ableist tropes, but just kind of reading. How do we read this passage in a way that acknowledges the histories of these readings and also push back against the kind of norming of those harmful tropes?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, what you said about looking at the ways that these identities intersect, because you could definitely have a Jewish disabled trans person reading this passage, and in their identity, all these things would be relevant for them, right? And so, as we think about how all these things connect, it's important for us to read together. I do see that the thought in the chat there from Nettle, who says, weren't John and Jesus and many of the early Christians also Jewish? Yes, they were. I don't see the Jews, quote unquote, as being anti-Semitic, just specifying that they weren't talking about the Gentiles in that context. Totally true, Nettle, that Jesus and so many of the folks that he surrounded himself with were Jewish. And so that it's not anti-Semitic to specify that they were Jewish or were Jews. That's not the anti-Semitic part. It's the way that John specifically talks about them in the story, which you'll see in a second. So we're going to dig into the story here and look at how John talks about these folks. So we're going to start out reading our passage here. We're going to start out reading verses 1 through 12. So this, again, is John 9. We're going to read verses 1 through 12. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. Katelyn, what are you reading from?
I just have the plain old vanilla NRSV.
Nice. The old school NRSV. Yeah. And Peter, what are you reading from?
And I've got the updated edition as well pulled up.
Cool. Okay. So if folks, as we're reading, who are reading from different translations, find some differences, let us know in the chat, because we're always happy to talk about those. So I'll start out and I'll read this first section here, verses 1 through 12. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am he," but they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, "I do not know." So that's the first section of our story here. This first sort of theme that we really wanted to touch on in this story is this connection between sin and differences and disability. Specifically, verse 2 there, where the disciples say, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And then Jesus says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so God's works would be revealed in him." So that's really what we're focusing in on with this first question is there a connection between sin and difference? What is Jesus saying here? So I think you had some thoughts about that, Katelyn.
Yeah, I think it's always so interesting to look at the difference between kind of what the disciples assume is happening and then what Jesus kind of responds with. Like with the disciples, there's this immediate connection between sin and blindness, and this like assumption of cause and effect. Rabbi, who sinned? Like, they don't even start with the person himself. It's what this man definitely sinned. Rabbi, who sinned? Was it his parents or him, that he was born blind? If sin, then blindness. And Jesus starts with the man. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. There's just an immediate, not just assumption of sin, but that immediate connection with the disciples, especially between kind of sin, or this sin and blindness, or just like a difference between who they are and who they see this man as. I just think that's so interesting, and that, yeah, I want to pause there. I just, that an immediate connection for the disciples.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, like what stories they were told and what stories they grew up with that made them make that immediate connection. Because connecting to some anti-Semitic readings, there are some writings and arguments that, like, well, all of Jewish culture just understood that difference and disability was connected to sin, which is not true. That is not, they had many different ways of understanding how this happened. This was not a like cultural universal thing. But so why did these disciples immediately make that connection? What was going on with them? So I want to throw out as a question to folks in the chat and to us as well, what stories or what connections did we grow up understanding between sin and things that we thought of as negative? Like, were we told that bad things happen to bad people, or like how did we grow up thinking about this? Peter, did you feel like you had any sort of sense of growing, like when you're growing up, being told like why bad things happened?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think if I can think of like concrete examples of that, but it definitely seemed like it was kind of in the water,
Mhm.
like just especially when it came to like your own personal responsibility and your own sin, and like how I think I often connected like my own experience with mental illness or depression with my sin, and I often heard that from uh, friends as well that grew up in different sort of conservative areas of Christianity, where it's like, oh, if you're feeling bad, that's probably because you did something bad.
You probably deserve it for some reason.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
I think that's one example that comes to mind.
Mhm. For sure. I think the one of the things that comes to mind for me is that like the disciples are immediately seeing this person and deciding that his blindness is a bad thing. Like, that's how they're making that connection, is like their blindness must be a bad thing and therefore he must have done something bad to deserve it. So it's kind of this a priori sort of thing about like, this is bad, I see it as bad, whereas like we don't know if the blind man thought of it as bad. Maybe he wouldn't have ever made that connection because he didn't see it as a bad thing. So there's a lot going on there. I want to check the
It's
chat.
interesting to see that society hasn't changed that much uh, with regards to disabilities and blindness too, that the disciples just kind of immediately pegged this as a sin issue, that something went wrong with either this man or his parents, and he was cursed because of this bad choice or something. But we also have people now, like I have friends who are blind, and one of them has related an experience to me about someone coming up to her and like starting to pray for healing, and she was just shocked and said like, I don't need healing for the blindness.
Mhm.
And it's so interesting that that has not changed since in 2000 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the center of the book that you read, Peter. That sense of somebody just praying for you out of the blue, assuming something negative.
Yeah, that's how the book starts. It's this like frequent experience that the author has of people coming up and praying for her against her will.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, identifying her disability as a problem to be solved or something that she needs to be freed of, when that's not her own experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see in the chat, Jenny says his blindness was a bad thing for him because it made him need to beg instead of work, not the same now. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that the disciples may have jumped to that conclusion, was because they saw this person as not being able to work, or like they saw begging as a negative thing, and therefore the cause, quote unquote, of the begging was the person's blindness. It's complicated though, because like what is that actually, it kind of comes back to that sense of what do we need to be healed of, because if maybe what needs to be healed is the ableism that would create a space in which the person couldn't like have and do the things that he wanted to do, right? And maybe the problem isn't the blindness, it's the situation. So yeah, it's complex for sure. I see that Julia says, why would a loving God give someone CP or any disability? And that is such a good question that we are going to talk more about, Julia, so hold on to that. Let's see. Nettle says, if you feel bad, you did something bad. Wasn't explicitly taught to me when I was a kid, but I definitely sort of believed it for a good portion of my life. Yeah, I think that goes back to what Peter said. It's just sort of in the air of like, you just sort of take it in without really thinking too much about it. Let's see. Let's talk about this bit here that you have about agency, Katelyn.
Yeah, I think in a lot of these like so-called healing parables, and also just in the Gospels, it's really an interesting question for me to look at, kind of who's making the decisions here. You know, is it Jesus? Is it the person? Like, who has agency? And I think in a lot of these uh, parables or just stories of Jesus interacting with another human being, like in the moment, like a real person that he's not telling a story of, um you know, he tells this man to go wash in the pool of Siloam, but like the man doesn't have to do that um at all, and he's not healed or given sight, um you know, until he goes and follows these directions, but he doesn't have to do that. And I think that's so interesting that he chooses, he doesn't know who this person is, kind of assumedly, but he does go choose to wash the mud that this random guy came and rubbed on his eyes. Like, I don't know if that would be the first thing or the last thing I would want to do, is follow his instructions. But like, Jesus just like spit on the ground and made some mud and rubbed it on my face. But like, nevertheless, like, it's a joint act between God through Jesus and this man himself. And I think that's so interesting, especially with kind of moving to the kind of the trans experience. Um, how I've always felt that transition for me is kind of an act of co-creation with God. And I've been thinking through that, like that idea of co-creating, where um, you know, I really hate the phrase that gets bandied about like fixing a mistake or something like that, that is just really weaponized, because I don't think that's what's happening at all. It's me living into who God has created and is creating me to be. Like, I recognize that there's a difference within me, um, and me kind of listening to this call internally. um you know, I felt like at some point God has told me to go wash in the pool of Siloam, and you know, my own trans experience and transition, in as broad a way as possible, is going to do that. It's just an act of agency, you know, with me and with God, us working together. And I think it's just a really similar, that spoke to me of maybe more than a lot of things in this passage, is that there's just a similarity there of uh, what this blind man gets to do and chooses to do.
Yeah, and that question of agency is such a big part of disability theology, that like the question of like, does the person ask for healing or do they not ask? Do they do a specific thing to seek out healing? Do they, like, when healing happens, like how does it happen and what agency is involved? And so yeah, the sense of this person, it's like he didn't ask for Jesus to put mud on his face, so we do have to question that a little bit. But he did have the choice to go and wash in this pool and then to come back. And then we have more of the story too, that he has a lot of agency in, more than a lot of people who are healed in the Gospels. So let's talk about that healing and that connection with sort of trans identities that we're talking about in this context, because one of the things that like people often point to is Jesus's response. Jesus says he was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. And going back to what, who was it now? It said, Julia said in the chat about like, why would a loving God create somebody like in a specific way that makes life hard for them? Some people have looked at this, at Jesus's response and said like, wait, is Jesus saying that God made this person blind just so that Jesus could heal him, to kind of like build Jesus up? Because that doesn't really flow with our understanding of like a loving and caring God who wants like health and wholeness for us, that God would put somebody in a position that is so difficult just so that Jesus can look like a good guy. So like there's got to be a different way of understanding that, right? To understand God differently, to understand this differently based on what we know of God in general. So one way that people have kind of flipped the script on this a little bit is to say, what if what was going on is that the man was like, God's works are revealed in this man before, during, and after this healing, like that there's more than just this moment in time that is important in terms of God's works being shown in this person. So there's for as we were reading some disability theologians' work, I read an article called "Human Disability and the Service of God" by Colleen C. Grant. Or it's in the book rather, Human Disability and the Service of God. And so Colleen says, Jesus began by stating that the man was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. As the story progresses, we discover that this revelation goes far beyond the healing of his disability. The work of God is even more evident in the man's gradually increasing faith and conviction before the opponents of Jesus. So we're going to read more about what's going on with this person, but maybe it's more about what the man is doing than it is about the moment of like healing that exists in this story. Let's see. Katelyn, you had a point here.
Yeah, I mean, like I kind of said this earlier, but that this man is presented to Jesus as kind of a theological problem to be solved. Like this feels like one of those trick questions that Jesus gets asked, who sinned, the man or his parents? And Jesus really reframes that and sees this person as a whole individual, even as the disciples see a disability and a difference. But Jesus is kind of offering another option, that God already is using this person and might still be using him in the future. Jesus doesn't say he will be healed so that God is revealed in him, but that he was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Nothing about healing, a gift of sight or disability. And I don't know, it brings up the question for me of whether the greater work of God is this, new ability of sight for the blind man, or if it's these words that are spoken later when pressed by the religious leaders. Is it the greater miracle that he receives sight, or that he kind of stands up for what he knows to be true when he's pressed on it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And like that, the thing that Jesus says that's very specific about, he was born blind so that this would be the case. It's not that he was healed so this would be the case. So like there's something going on there previous to this that is important. Peter, I think you had a quote from your source on that too.
Yeah, Amy Kenny talks about that again, like specifically about how the disability itself is the site of an encounter with God, rather than like this, the healing moment. It's like his experience of blindness that is in fact like where like God's glory is shown. So she says Jesus inverts their idea of blindness by showing the disciples that disability becomes a place of encounter with the glory of God. Jesus interacts with, she calls him Zach, the man born blind, she gives him a name. Jesus interacts with Zach directly, talking not just about him, but to him and with him. According to Jesus, Zach's blindness didn't result from his or his parents' sin, but instead, his blindness displays God. What a powerful subversive statement. Disability helps reveal the light of the world to people who think of themselves as holier than disabled people. Disability is no longer a symbol of sin, but one of being open to revelation. Disability unveils God's work to the community if only people are willing to receive. So I think that's just a profound kind of reframe there.
Totally. And I love that she gives him a name.
Yeah.
Because it's true, we don't have this guy's name. And like so many times in these stories of Jesus interacting with people, we never know what their name is. So I love that she gives him one. So yeah, go ahead, Katelyn.
I'm jumping in here, and I didn't put these in our notes, but
That's okay.
I think this is such an interesting question that is tough and really challenging, especially as somebody had asked about, why would a loving God give someone CP or any disability? And it's kind of, it is challenging, excuse me, because it's not a simple answer by any means, and it's not a one size fits all. And we can see different points in Scripture, both Old and New Testament, where God purposefully disables people. When you think of Paul on the road to Damascus, where Paul is blinded, but that might be the first time he can really see in his life. And even when he's healed, he still deals with a difference in sight for the rest of his life. He also talks about like a thorn. God gave him a thorn in his side. Or you think about Moses, who was not a good speaker and was really afraid of that, but God uses him through that. God, I'm still thinking of different ones. I mean, God disables Jacob and gives Jacob a new name of Israel. It's kind of, what do you do with a disabling God? But it's also kind of, I think it helps really subvert my expectations of what is disability. Why does our society think of, disability as a bad thing? Like, why do we still think of blindness as kind of a problem to be solved, rather than something that God created? And I think that really does speak to me as a trans person, and something I think Amory said about, when parents respond less than helpfully, kind of, where did I go wrong? Or again, fixing God's mistakes. It's like, well, I don't think this is a mistake. It's challenging, but I think that my differences and identities reveal God in their own way.
Absolutely. Yeah. For folks that are interested in hearing more about different perspectives on like a lot of those stories, and just disability theology in general, this reminds me of Nancy Eastland's book, The Disabled God, which is like one of these big like pillars of disability theology. So there's a lot more we can say there about God and disability. And like you said, Katelyn, this is a complex thing, because as we're talking about this as trans folks, we're not saying being trans and being disabled are the same, right? But we are saying that there are differences and like physical difference and identity difference that are at play here that people perceive as negative. And maybe for the people who are existing with those differences, it's not necessarily a negative thing. And that's like one of the connecting points here in this story. People assume maybe that being trans is negative, like the number of people that come up to you and you're like, oh, you're so brave for being trans. And you're like, I'm just being me. Like, I'm literally just trying to survive. I don't really have much of a choice, honestly. I'm trying my best. So it's that sense of like, people see something as automatically negative, even though we might not necessarily see it as negative. But I want to go to what Amory posted here. That Amory says, this reminds me of my own mother's reaction when I came out to her. She questioned, where did we go wrong? Yeah, so let's talk about parents. The next section of this passage that we're going to read is verse 13 through 23. Do you want to read this one, Peter?
Sure. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath. Others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself."
Oh, I think we got one more verse there, or
Or
two
one
more
more verse
verses.
through 23.
Through 23.
Gotcha. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him."
Yeah, so here we bring in the parents, and the sort of Sunday trial begins. Or Sabbath day, so it would have been Saturday trial, begins here with all of these folks standing around. And I think, like, coming to what Amory said, that like these parents are sort of flummoxed. They're not really sure what to do. They're like, we know this is our son. We know he was born blind. We don't know anything that happened in the middle or what's going on now. And then we get the sort of that end note of his parents saying this because they were afraid, right? And so this is that bit about sort of pitting pitting people against quote unquote the Jews or the Jewish people, which is like these parents were, and the blind man himself was Jewish, right? But we're kind of setting this idea of like good people versus bad people up. So there's this sense of like the parents are afraid, right? And so they kind of put the thing back on the formerly blind man. So the thing that's like sort of a glass half empty, glass half full situation here is that the parents do recognize their son. They do say, "This is our son." And they do say he was born blind, but now we don't know what's going on. And so I kind of wonder for folks in the chat, and I'm going to ask the folks here too, does this make you sort of like, how does this make you feel about these parents? Do you think these parents do you kind of wish they would have like been more courageous? Do you kind of feel, well, at least they recognized their son and that's a good thing, that they didn't sort of denounce him and say, we don't know that guy? How do you feel about these parents and how they responded? Katelyn, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something to say for, you wish parents are always more excited for their kids with whatever revelation they have. But I also want to say that like they recognize like, no, this is our son. Like we see him, and like, yes, he was born blind, but they start with the son first and then, address the change. It's kind of a middle of the road response, but they also, they're afraid, but they also know that their son can speak for himself. And I appreciate that, that they said why are you asking us what happened? Like, talk to him. He was like, we don't know, but like, ask him. He's of age. Like, talk to him. I think that's really interesting. Um, you know, especially as we think about our own parental responses to different things that we've told our parents in our lives, like, what would it have been like if our parents had kind of respected what we said, or just if that response had been different, kind of a less middle of the road or something. I just appreciate that, this is our son. Clearly he's can see now, and ask him, like, he's the best source of information on this.
Totally. Yeah, the sort of I see what Amory says here in the chat here as well. Or no, Julia says in the chat, he is of age is a respect thing. Yeah, the sense of like, you don't have to ask us as his parents. He's an adult. He knows what he's talking about. That could definitely be seen as a respect thing. I can see that. Peter, what are your thoughts about these parents?
Yeah, it's a little hard to tell like what exactly their motivations are here. I mean, it's always interesting to me when the writer of the story sort of ascribes motivations
Mm-hmm.
to people, because like you can't really tell that just from what they said. Like
Mhm.
the implication is, oh, they knew everything that had happened and they were just trying to like disavow Jesus.
Mhm.
It's like maybe they just wanted, to, as you were saying, Caitlin, like give their son the ability to speak for himself, which is kind of great, actually.
Mhm. Yeah, it's one of those great things where you can look at it and you can definitely see both ways of looking at it. Like they're both equally plausible.
Mhm.
And I think like what Amory said in the chat here, parents are impacted by social pressures and expectations. Absolutely. And I think, if we go with that kind of reading, where it says, they were afraid that they were going to be kicked out, or afraid that they would be um, uh, to be sort of kicked out of the synagogue at this point would be to be sort of kicked out of community, right? To be kind of cut off and be on your own. And that fear is something that affects parents today, like about their kids, a lot of the times, especially if their kids, for instance, are queer or trans. They're afraid of what the church will say. And so when I was reading through, I was looking at the queer Bible commentary. Robert E. Goss wrote the section on John, and he says, out of fear, the parents equivocate between their blind son now healed and the religious fundamentalists. They realize that to answer is siding with their son, and that this means religious exclusion. Thus, they opted to testify to their son's blindness from birth and now his ability to see. How often parents have been forced to choose between their children who come out and their church, with its narrow ethical definitions and rituals of exclusion and coercion. So yeah, this is a moment where it's a distinct connection. What'd you say, Peter?
I said that part, that last sentence. That's
Mm-hmm.
very real. Um, yeah, and if you think about that as what's going on here, it's definitely very resonant. I think probably to some of the experiences that some of us have had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I think all of us, if we know that our parents are reacting badly, or our family members in general are reacting badly because of their own fear, it can be easier to be compassionate, I think, to be able to be like, I know that you're scared that you're going to lose your community, you're going to lose the people that you care about. Um, and so I think understanding that can lead to some good compassion. And so that's why I think these parents specifically, it's more easy to be understanding about them, because it's sort of couched in this idea of like fear of exclusion. And that's a legitimate thing. We know how that feels, a lot of us. Um, so we're getting close to our hour, so we got to get to our next section here. So what happens next with this man born blind when the parents say, well, you should probably just ask him what he thinks and what he says happened. So Caitlin, do you want to read verses 24 through 34?
Sure. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out.
What a section. It puts me immediately back to every conversation I've had with, picketers and Bible thumpers outside protesting stuff, where it's like, we're actually having a decent conversation in which I'm making some really good points, and you're just like, get out of here, sinner. Like, okay, then I guess we weren't going to have a conversation after all. Never mind.
I love the sort of like dry, it reads like sarcasm of
Yeah.
some of the responses.
Mhm.
It's like, Why do you want to hear it again? You want me to repeat myself? Like, oh, I
Did you
see.
want to
You
go
want
be
to
one of
become
his
a
disciples?
disciple. Is that what it is? Like,
So snarky.
very snarky. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that you laughed a bit when you read it, Caitlin, because I can imagine him snickering when he said it. Yeah, there's this moment of kind of this person saying like, no, for real, like I've told you before, right? So I wonder what gives this man the courage to talk like this in front of the authorities, in the front of people who could kick him and his parents out of the community. What gives him the courage to do that? What gives him the sort of chutzpah to do that? Because I think I really like what he says, where he says, I have no idea who this guy was, but I do know that I was blind and now I see. And like, I'm just telling you exactly what happened, right? And that to me reminds me so much of the experience of like the trans Christians I know and work with, and my own experience, where it's like, listen, I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to talk to you necessarily about like how all this connects to all of our wider theology. I don't necessarily know whose fault this is, quote unquote, that I am the way I am. But what I do know is this is me. And so there's just that sense of like, this guy knew what he was talking about. And I really appreciate that. Um,
I
yeah.
feel like it's this sense that this man who is formerly blind now, just realizes that he's been part of something bigger, that it's not just about the gift of sight, that more easily enables him theoretically to engage with society. Like he says, he opened my eyes, which to me feels like a fuller sense of like a divine revelation than just this moment of like physical healing, but he's been brought into a fuller connection with God. But it's still like ultimately it still drives him out of the community, which is just it's this hard. I'm not going to say dichotomy, but like almost like a sliding scale of like this person. Like we meet him as in verse 1, as he walked in 9 verse 1, as he walked along he saw a man blind from birth. Like he's likely like begging, um and then at the end he's talking to the religious leaders like he's a courtroom lawyer and is a little snarky. Like he's grown a lot just in these like 34 verses. But at the same time, like he's feeling more internally kind of coherent, um, but externally his world is like really shifting, and it's becoming a lot harder for him to exist in his community. I mean, verse 34 ends and they drove him out, which is, I mean, to put it lightly, like a bummer. Like he's been part of this, like his whole life has just changed for a number of reasons, and yet his community is still challenging him.
Yeah, it reminded me, even as I was reading this, like before we were even kind of typing up our notes, it reminded me of something you said recently, Caitlin, about trans people and the experiences of trans folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it mirrors a queer experience, but I'm thinking of kind of trans experiences in particular, about how coming out, this idea that like coming out makes things easier on the inside, but harder on the outside. So internally, you're feeling more at peace and calmer and more confident in yourself. And maybe your presentation has changed, or a name or pronouns, but there's less, dysphoria around you. And you're starting to live into something that just feels like it makes more sense. The internal, gears in your clock aren't grinding anymore. But then externally, the forces of society are kind of grinding your gears. I mean, it just becomes harder to exist in the world in a lot of ways, as our society currently is, especially with all of the anti-transgender legislation all around the country. It's just this question of, okay, well, I feel more like myself, but am I less safe? And it's a hard, it's a hard place to be in, because I am who I am, and that's not going to change. And I love myself now in a way that I don't know if I did before kind of going through a lot of therapy and coming out to myself. But also it's really challenged my life in a lot of ways that I did expect and ways that I didn't. And I kind of wonder for this man, first of all, we're not really sure if he asked for healing in the first place, but he does have some agency in following through on Jesus's direction. But you know, personally for him, he's now able to engage with society as it's set up in an easier way. Um, but also, he's being driven out by that same society, even with this gift of sight. And it's just a challenging place for him to be in as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it resonates for a lot of folks, that sense of like, maybe he's feeling more confident in himself because he knows himself and he's had an experience that he trusts. But yeah, the outside is more difficult. And that feels very relevant, I think, for a lot of us, especially right now. So we've got this sort of moment. And I wanted to say that Jolene in the chat talked about this. I said kind of like what had the religious people done for him prior to this, and then Jesus healed him. And so there is kind of a question of like, how connected was this person to the community that he was in before? Because if he was out begging, then maybe he wasn't being properly taken care of by the people who should have been taking care of him. So there's questions there too about like that maybe part of this courage comes from trusting somebody who actually came and cared for him as he was. That might be part of it too. So we've got this moment where the formerly blind man is kicked out of his community, right? And things are not like he's doing okay internally, but the external part is difficult. So the last bit of our story here, verse 35 through 41, which I will read. Jesus heard that they had driven him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "I came into the world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains." So we get this moment here where a couple things are happening. One thing that I think that we can take courage from is the very first sentence there, where it says, when Jesus heard that they had driven him out, when he found him, he said. And so there's this moment of like, Jesus is keeping an eye out for this guy. Like he hears that something bad has happened and he's like, I'm going to go find that guy. Jesus doesn't just leave him kicked out, right? Jesus says, I'm going to go find this person and make him part of this community now that I'm creating. And I really appreciate that, because the fear of exclusion can be so large that I think we have to trust that there's going to be something after that, that we're not just going to be changed and then left on our own and left by ourselves. So I like that Jesus does that immediately, that he finds this person. This sense of like what's happening here, and what Jesus decides to do is kind of the sense of the upside down kingdom that we hear about a lot, especially in like the Gospel of Luke, the sense of reversals. And so what Jesus is doing here with reversals is saying, I've come to make the blind see and make the people who see blind, right? And that like, if you think you can see, maybe you can't. And if you can see, maybe you're seeing something else. And so there's a lot of weird reversals going on here at the end of this story that Jesus is sort of taking a look at. But I think it's important to note that like this isn't just Jesus changing somebody's life and then leaving them. This is about Jesus changing the whole world. So when we talked at the very beginning, when Peter had that quote about how like the problem is the ableism, right, not the disability, like that's part of maybe what's being turned upside down. And the same thing when we think about the difficulty of coming out as a trans person, that like the problem is not that we're trans, the problem is the transphobia. So like that can be something that can be turned upside down, right? So there's a hopeful sort of end note here about Jesus finding the people who are excluded, bringing them in, and then turning things around so that the world isn't like it was before, that we can kind of wait for the world to be different. So I know we had a couple other last thoughts here. What am I missing, y'all? Oh, maybe I'll just, I think both Peter and I have a little couple of things here that we might want to talk about quickly before we end. But just to put a dot on that piece I just said, in that article by Colleen C. Grant, she talks about, she says, in the end, the typical sin and sickness metaphor is reversed so that blindness is no longer a symbol for humanity's sinfulness. It's instead representative of a state of innocence and openness to revelation. So what happens if we take the closing words of Jesus more literally? How might this inform our understanding about the relationship between persons with disabilities and the church? It may suggest that those who are sighted and who have perceived themselves as the normal able-bodied members of the church might be more in need of healing than the so-called disabled. So again, it's that reversal of like, maybe the people who think that they have all the answers are the ones that don't quite get it. So Katelyn and Peter, anything else we want to say as we kind of come to the end of our story here?
I think there's a really interesting, the presence of God in this story is really interesting because you get a sense that God has been active in this man's life from before he was born, watches over him, and kind of instigates this, like this man's actions in the Gospel of John, at least. But he was born blind so that God's work might be revealed in him, like meaning that like God has work for him that will be revealed. And then through the man's like testimony, like all he speaks about is Jesus. And then it ends with Jesus coming back into his life after who knows how long. But like God has not forgotten him and still is active in his life. And I think that's really, I think that's a stronger and fuller picture than you get in a lot of kind of these, so-called healing stories where, the friends lower the paralyzed person through the roof and Jesus does his thing and then the story ends. And this is just a much fuller, longer idea that like God has been active in this person's life and has, work for him to do, before and after meeting him in person.
Yeah, and that all of the things that he's experienced and all the things that he has been this entire time inform his ability to do that work. What were you gonna say, Peter?
Yeah, I like those thoughts, Katelyn, and just like thinking about healing in this story as being about a lot more than this act of restoring sight, and being about bringing someone into right relationship or into community, and the fact that like we have this moment of him being kicked out or rejected from the community that he was a part of, but that community, as you pointed out, was like not caring for him well, was not recognizing his gifts. And so then at the end, he's like drawn into a new kind of community with Jesus, where he will have the ability to share those gifts and be who he is and speak about his own experience with confidence. And like, that seems very like a much more profound kind of healing than just like a change in his body.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a story about a combination of literal and metaphorical, like the entire way through. And like, yeah, the literal and metaphorical, the physical and the emotional and the spiritual, like there's many layers going on in this story all at once. Well, thanks everybody for being here with us tonight. Thank you to you, Katelyn, and to Peter, and to everybody in the chat for being here talking about this story. It's just such a good one, and one worth talking about. So thank you all for being here. Again, the only announcement I have is that we don't have a Bible study live happening in March because of our programming break. You can go to our website, transmissionministry.com, to find our program calendar and know what's going on there. But we have a programming break next month, so we'll be back in April with another Bible study live. And until then, I hope you all have a wonderful evening and a wonderful rest of your month. And stay in touch. You can get a hold of all the TMC stuff on our website, and we'll see you around support groups and the Discord and everywhere else. So, night, everybody.